Hey everybody, how you doing? Good to be here in Antalya. So my name is Dave Troy, as you heard. I'm a serial entrepreneur, angel investor, community activist, and all-around startup guy in the town of Baltimore, Maryland, in the United States, which is about 30 miles from Washington, D.C. I have been active as an entrepreneur since I was 14 years old. I started my first business when I was in high school selling computers and software. Ultimately morphed that into the internet service provider and hosting and telco business. Sold that company to the parent company of the Weather Channel in 2004. And since then have been exploring a variety of different startup things, as well as investing in some companies and also developing my own startup called 410 Labs, and we have a product called Maelstrom. What I wanted to talk to you today about is how you can use data as a way of kind of opening the door to different ways of seeing. And I'm going to show you some examples of different kinds of the way that data can be presented that I think you might find useful as you think about developing startup concepts and working within the context of your existing startups. So what I want to show you first is infographics. Now, you hear about data visualization, and sometimes people confuse the idea of infographics with data visualization. And here's an example of one that was done by some friends of mine that is, a perfectly lovely infographic, but it's really, not a data visualization. It's not, data really. It's an editorial illustration that shows how a bunch of different brands are aligned in the context of the social universe, and so it's something that people will pass around as a kind of a social object, and it's something that can be good for marketing, but it's not really data visualization per se. Likewise with this illustration here, a lovely infographic, but you notice how things like these numbers don't seem to correlate, like there's no reason why that 80 is bigger than this 149, it's just an infographic that can be shared around. And it's important to kind of put that in a different category, because what I want to show you next is really focusing more on the data side. This is, really just a marketing illustration. So, towards that end, when you do data visualization, it should actually convey information. And what do I mean by information? Well, if you consult people like Claude Shannon, who was the developer of information theory at AT&T Bell Labs during the 20th century, it's basically the idea that you're getting something out of the presentation and the information that you didn't already know. It's new information that changes your knowledge set. So take a look at this data visualization, and I'm going to call this one out for being not a very good data visualization, but it is still a data visualization. What this is supposed to be is a map of all devices connected to the internet on planet Earth, and with the red being areas of higher density. Well, the question that I would have about this is it accurate, and does it tell you something that you don't already know? The notion that we basically see that there are devices where there are people is not exactly surprising. The other thing is that there really isn't an accurate way to measure the location of devices on the internet, because nobody really has that information. You can sort of try to get that from like IP addresses and stuff, but IP addresses don't inherently have a geography to them, and often the geography information that we do have for them is wrong. So I would say this is an example of bad data visualization that tries to tell you something not only that isn't very interesting from the standpoint of anything new, it's also telling you something wrong. To prove this point, look at how this is a satellite image released by NASA that shows the Earth at night, and you'll notice that the devices on the internet corresponds pretty much to where the lights are on the planet Earth. So congratulations, we have learned that the internet coincides with people. And likewise, you can see that looking at population density around the world, more or less is exactly the same as that internet device map. So I would encourage you to, when you're visualizing data, ask yourself the question, am I telling somebody anything that they didn't already know, and is it correct? So data visualization done right offers really new ways of seeing. This is my hometown of Baltimore, Maryland in the United States. And what I did here was create a map of all the Twitter users in the city. And this is not a geographic map of any kind. Each dot represents a Twitter user account, so a person or a small business potentially. And then each line represents a follow relationship. And what you can see when you actually dig into this is that people like me tend to be over here. I'm on the very far end of the overall population of the city, and I'm the exact opposite of these people over here. So these people don't really know any people over here, and that's why they're further apart. This visualization uses something called a force-directed graph that basically treats the relationships like springs, and then each of the individual nodes repel each other. But what this illustrates here is that there's a lot of racial separation in a city like Baltimore. The folks over here are predominantly African American, and the folks over here are predominantly Caucasian. So I start with this to kind of show that you can use data visualization to see something that you thought you knew really well in a very different kind of way. Now, some things that you can do in the context of your startup is to visualize data that can help you solve problems that you have within the context of your startup. One of those things would be to use it to help understand investors. This is a visualization that I made of all the angel list data around investors in Europe and the Middle East, and it shows how they all interrelate and who knows who. So as you're pondering things like, what investors to contact, who can I potentially pull in that's maybe, co-invest with somebody else that's already investing, this kind of an analysis can be very helpful in terms of understanding where you might have some success. Likewise, this is a map of investors in Asia, including Turkey. You can see here that they form a distinct lobe, and that it's sort of next to Russia, next to China, opposite of India, Singapore up here, and then Israel down here. So as you're trying to figure out how to navigate the landscape, this sort of thing can be a useful way of seeing. So in addition, you can also use this to do things like analyze markets. So my company has a product in the email space called Maelstrom, which is actually right here. And we wanted to get a sense of the other players in the market as well as other investors that were working in the space. So we made this visualization to help us do that. And one of the things that you'll find when you make these kinds of graph visualizations is that being central is actually really important to success. Stuff that's sort of floating out on the edge here means that it doesn't have a lot of buy-in from the people in the middle of the network, and as you become more entrenched with the industry and with investors and whatnot, you'll tend to move towards the center. So that's something interesting that you can use as you interpret this kind of data. This is another market analysis that I did for a friend of the intersection between education and finance, because her company is focused in that intersection. And this, again, is a way of helping to understand the construction of that market. And then this is a map of all of the investors in the United States. And these are available on the website. There's a Flickr gallery, peoplemaps.org, you can go to and look at some of these. But basically this gives you a sense of how all the investors in the United States interact. So there's just kind of a New York lobe and a Boston lobe, and then San Francisco is looming large, and there's some people that kind of move in between those markets as well. The other thing that you can do is use this kind of data analysis to look at data that might help you in terms of hiring and finding employees. I made this map of all the employers in Baltimore related by the employees that they had ever shared. So what tends to happen in this environment is you end up grouping industry clusters. So this is like education. This is Johns Hopkins University and some other universities, University of Maryland and whatnot near there. And then this is the financial industry, which is big in Baltimore. T. Rowe Price and Legg Mason and Morgan Stanley, and then defense contractors and stuff over here. So this can be a very helpful way of understanding the economic reality around you. The other thing that you can do with this is try to understand users. So we were curious, again, being in the email business, if we could learn some interesting things about the co-occurrence of email marketers in people's inboxes. So we took a look at all the different mailing sort of email marketing companies that co-occur together, and it turns out that people that are getting stuff from Amazon.com also get a lot of stuff from Groupon and Apple and Living Social, and then Thrillist and Jack Threads and Inside Hook, they all sort of occur up here together. So, this is a very sort of basic analysis, but it's the kind of data that you tend to produce in startups, and this can be a helpful way of understanding it. The other thing you can do with data visualization is use it to develop new ways of creating product concepts. So this is something that we're currently in the process of developing. It's a little bit early stage, so take it with a grain of salt, but it's going to be out in a couple months. And this is a real-time visualization of my inbox. So this is a totally new way of looking at email, and it came about by thinking about it in terms of data visualization rather than thinking about it in terms of like what would a normal email client look like. We went at it from a totally different standpoint and said, how could we visualize the inbox in a way that's meaningful and use that to create a product? So lastly, you heard from others today, from Kalina, talking about Simon Sinek's talk around why, the power of why. It's important that as you develop a startup, you be doing something that's really meaningful and that has an impact on humanity in some important way, hopefully. And some of the work that I've been doing lately uses data visualization to help us understand our cities in a lot more depth. So what I've been doing is, you saw the map of Baltimore. I've been mapping other cities around the world too. And we're probably going to develop this into a product over the next year or so. It's quite complex to do, and there's a lot of details to work out. But it's something that's showing a great deal of promise in terms of people's interest in the topic. This is San Francisco, and what you can see here is that there's a large emerging globe of kind of geeks and tech companies at the, in the city, and these are actually creating tensions within San Francisco because a lot of the people that are part of sort of the traditional culture of the city are starting to resent the intrusion of all this new venture money, which is causing to do things like rents to go up and apartments to be harder to find and restaurants to become too expensive and things like that. So you can actually use this as a way of mapping culture. But it's not quite as interesting as a city like Istanbul. I was in Istanbul to present some of this work a few months ago, and one of the things that we found in looking at this is that there is a really large cohort of young men, primarily the age of like 17 to 21, who seem to be, you can't quite read this probably, but it says young men, mostly frustrated young men, who really, really want girls to like them, and they write poetry to prove it. And this came from a friend of mine who helped to interpret this data and offered that as a kind of a descriptor of that group of people. But there's an interesting phenomenon here, which is that this group of people, as they become more politically active and start to take hold in the culture more, are going to have a big impact on the future of Istanbul and the future of Turkey. The notion that we can actually see and understand how these people are going to impact the social climate of the country as things move forward is a really powerful tool. And it's one that we need to make sure is in the hands of people and not just in the hands of government. One thing that you find in places where the internet is censored is that things like gay pornography tend to turn up as their own little island because people can't get access to those things through normal channels, so they'll create channels on networks like Twitter. And you see the same thing in Saudi Arabia down here. And you can see also that right-wing thinking tends to be opposed to liberal thinking, not entirely surprisingly. These teenage girls down here probably shouldn't be talking formally, but they are. So they're a little isolated from everybody else, but you notice that they're on kind of the liberal end of the spectrum. And then likewise, there's two lobes that are in support of the two major football teams in Saudi Arabia. This is St. Louis, Missouri, in the United States. You probably heard about Ferguson and Black Lives Matter and all of the uproar that came about from that. And it was interesting to see that in that city, you again, like Baltimore, see a pattern of great racial divide. Most of the people on this part of the network are African American. Most of the people on this part are Caucasian, and in this part. And in the middle, there's kind of a gulf. There's really not a lot of connection between the people on those two different sides of the network. And you could actually, some people ask, could you use this kind of data to prevent the next Ferguson or to somehow or another predict it? And I don't think that you can necessarily, but I think that just like, in places where you have say like two wires that are just at the right distance apart to cause a spark, and there's a lot of voltage between them, you can predict that places like this, with this kind of a social configuration, will be the places where violence and other kinds of tensions will erupt. This is Barcelona, and Barcelona is sort of remarkable in that it's kind of like a little beach ball. It's very happy. But you do see some interesting things here too. The Catalonian separatist movement is very clearly described here. And then you have FC Barcelona, not surprising, big group of fans of that up here. And then a bunch of writers, entrepreneurs, arts and culture, literature, and then mainstream media kind of right in the middle, and then some left-wing criticism down here. It's interesting to note that the Catalonian independence folks are at the opposite side of the entrepreneurs. And it's not to say that the entrepreneurs aren't interested in Catalonian independence exactly, but you can understand why, with their focus on business and tech and stuff like that, they may not be as politically active as the folks that are, really into this issue. And again, you can see this. The other thing that's, how the whole city is constructed, you can see it in this data. And the other thing that's interesting in Barcelona is that unlike, say, Baltimore or St. Louis, there doesn't seem to be that eccentricity, the strong notion of racial or ethnic divide. Now that brings us to this. Whether you're talking about Tahrir Square or Gezi Park or the Ukraine or Hong Kong or even Occupy Wall Street or any of the other social media fueled movements that have occurred over the last few years, you can make the argument that if they had had access to some of this data that showed how the city and region were constructed in terms of the networks, that they might have had a better strategy for effecting change through this sort of a uprising. And I think it's arguable that the reason why most of these things faded out and went away, or at least people feel like they didn't achieve their goals fully, is because they simply ran out of people, because people were treating social media as if it was a black box that would produce an infinite number of people to support some cause, when in fact you simply burn through your networks at some point and you can't find any new people. This is important, and it's important because this kind of data, used in this context, can determine the success or failure of political movements. In that regard, it's as important as free press. Because if you think about it, what media has always done is tell us how power is connected in the context of a place, and to help us figure out how to make sense of the world around us. We're starting to be able to use data in that same way. It's early days, sure, but in 10 or 15 years, this is going to be an issue that we're all going to have to grapple with around how do we get, use, share, and maintain this data. Now, this is one that I did in preparation for this trip, and I haven't finished it yet because it takes a lot of work to do this, and I'm hoping to get some collaborators in Cairo. I've got several people that have contacted me about working with me on this, but this is the structure of Cairo, and I just wanted to show it to you to give you a sense of how this kind of map is made. The first thing we do is get all the data, and I use the Twitter API to do that. It's kind of complicated how we're doing that right now, but it's totally on the up and up, and it works. And then what we start to do is to, let me go back. We put everything into this kind of force-directed graph makeup so you can see how everything lays out. And then we assign colors to it based on community. Community is a technical term. It's detected within the data set, and it basically says that the people who are blue have more friends in common than with people who are yellow, et cetera. So each group has this sort of shared common friend group. And then what you have to do is start to study each of these groups and understand what it is they're talking about. What is it that has drawn them together in terms of their commonality? And you can usually very quickly detect patterns around, like, if you use things like just pulling out their most commonly shared hashtags and links and stuff, you can get a sense very quickly of kind of who they are. So this is a work in progress. I would imagine maybe in a month or so we'll have a full version done of this that's pretty editorially accurate. But I wanted to give you a sense of what another city looks like. And I will guess that this will be some sort of a lobe around conservative political stuff, and this will be some sort of more liberal lobe, but we won't know until we really dig into it further. So in the context of a startup, I want to just kind of give you a sense that there are a lot of tools out there already made that can help you take the data that you're generating from your users and from your databases and whatnot and visualize it in reasonable ways. Some of the tools that are the most popular and that I would recommend that you check out are Mixpanel, Crashlytics, Kissmetrics, Google Analytics, Optimizely, Crazy Egg. There's sort of a tool for almost everything out there now, and there's a few cases where you really need to build your own version of a tool like this. But one thing I wanted to just point out is that almost all of these tools tend to generate output that looks kind of like this. Line graphs and bar graphs, pie charts, very traditional kind of data representation. And I wanted to just give you a thought that, that's a very 17th century kind of way of visualizing data. We have, for time immemorial, been recording data in logbooks, right? And keeping track of time series of events and kind of going, okay, well, this happened then, and then that happened, and this and whatnot. And then we tend to try to group it together in some way, make graphs, and generate this sort of thing. The reason why data has always kind of looked like this is because that's the tool set that we've had. And I would argue that with the new tools that are available, we can start to produce very different kinds of visualizations that will yield startling new insights into how stuff works and how you can solve problems in new and interesting ways. There's a lot of folks in the computer security field who are starting to use the kind of graph analytics that I showed as a way of detecting threats and whatnot. And that's the kind of thing that you could never really get out of log file-based analysis alone. So I want to encourage you to use first principles when you're thinking about data and you're thinking about products and how to analyze user behavior, et cetera. If you think about Elon Musk, what does he do, right? He says, well, why can't we have electric cars that run for 300 miles? Well, we need to think about how the batteries work and think about how the drivetrain works. And he goes to first principles. Likewise, with the Hyperloop, why can't we have a train that runs in a tube that goes from LA to San Francisco in 30 minutes? And he goes through and he figures out, okay, well, in order for that to work, we've got to get rid of the air in front of the train, and we've got to put a fan on it, and then we've got to use Bernoulli's principle to make sure the thing floats, and then it needs to be on a maglev, electric induction motor thing. And then he figures out kind of how to do it, and sure enough, it's a reasonable design that people actually start investing in. So as you're digging into data, start thinking about the fundamental nature of the data, the things you can do with it. There's tons of resources available now on the internet for understanding data in new ways. And if you'd like to start getting involved in some of the graph-based analytics that I was showing, these are some interesting tools that you can use to do that. One is this Gephi package that is free, and I used that to make most of the visualizations here. The input to that is just a sparse matrix of data. And then also d3.org is a web-based visualization package that allows you to do all kinds of different graph representations. Sigmajs.org is also a really good web-based graph package. And then there's an interesting thing called BioFabric that you might want to check out as well. So I just want to convey the notion that not everything needs to be a bar or a line graph. You can create all sorts of interesting things, and we have tools now in the form of modern computers and the cloud and whatnot that can enable you to do some really stunning stuff that'll let you see the world in a new way. So this is me. If you'd like to contact me or collaborate on any sort of mapping thing, please let me know. You can reach me at dave@410labs.com. The mapping work is available at peoplemaps.org. My blog is here, my product is here. You can also contact me on both Facebook, just under David Troy, and actually facebook.com/Dave Troy, and then on LinkedIn as David Troy. So thank you very much, and good luck with all your startups.